well, what should society look like? And what I have to spend a lot of time there is the things that are not going to happen as disasters. Everyone will immediately say, oh my God, you're just going to have murderers running around on the streets. Obviously not. There's a way to protect society from dangerous people without telling the dangerous people they have rotten souls. It's a quarantine model, and it's straight out of public health sort of stuff. Oh my God, okay, that, but then everybody else is going to run amok because you can't be held responsible for anything. Everyone will just become antisocial. And there's a whole literature of research on that showing that, in effect, for the first 5 minutes, you're going to run amok. And once you've had the chance to think about it, and especially grow up with these ideas, you will have just as ethical of standards as somebody who believes we should be held responsible for our every action. In the exact same way that sort of parallel, people who are atheists, people say, oh my God, they're going to run amok and be so immoral because they don't think there's anyone who can hold them responsible. And that's what people do for the first 5 seconds, or the first 5 years of them deciding there is no God. But you give them enough time, and they are exactly as ethical in their behavior as people who are highly, highly religious. You've just found your meaning through a different route there. Okay, so that's not going to be a problem. Then people freak out and they say, well, if everything's determined, nothing can ever change. Don't bother. And that's like a critical point that, like, of course we change. Massive change occurs, but we are not choosing to exercise free will when we suddenly form a new opinion. We have been changed by circumstance, and we've been changed by it as a function of who we turned out to be at the moment that we experience that circumstance. So with all of those, like, things in place, of things not to panic about, and change can actually happen, but it works very differently than people think it does. If you believe in free will, we're not going to run amok. We don't have murderers running around everywhere. We can get through that. I think what you're left with is exactly what you were alluding to, which is, if you believe in free will, it means you're okay with some people being treated way better than the average human for reasons they had nothing to do with, and other people being treated way worse. And if you really go for this, there's no free will stuff, blame and punishment are intellectually and ethically gibberish. Praise and reward are as well. Feeling as if you have earned anything, that anyone has earned anything, that you are entitled to anything, that there's such a thing as justice being carried out, that there's such a thing as justice. None of that makes any sense at all. And you got to navigate stuff from there, which is where the, oh my God, how are we supposed to function with that? And what seems clear is, like, you know, I haven't believed in this free will stuff since I was a kid. And most of the time, my first reflex is to operate like an entitled, like westernized American, whatever. You know, I think this way and I can't function this way most of the time. It takes a whole lot of work to say, wait a second. Think about, like, what it is that you had no control over that got you into this, like, wonderfully advantageous place. Think about that person you were just having a judgment about, all of that. And, you know, what we're left with is it's going to be mighty hard for everyone to decide there's no free will tomorrow, and thus society just takes off from there with no more prisons and no more meritocracy and no more CEOs with corner offices and no more. Yeah, it's going to be incredibly hard. But what I try to hammer through in that latter part of the book is, over and over, historically, we have identified realms where it turns out we don't have free will. People do stuff that they had no control over. And each time we figure that out and come up with what would be a biological explanation, not only doesn't society fall apart, the world becomes more humane. We figured out that old ladies with no teeth don't have the power to control the weather by casting witchcraft or whatever. And so it's not the 15th century anymore, and burning people at the stakes when there's suddenly a storm in the middle of July. Good. We figured out witches don't exist. They don't have the power to control the weather. And it's a much better world that we don't burn old ladies at the stake anymore. We figured out at some point that having an epileptic seizure is not a sign that you were possessed by Satan. And that's good. We stopped, stopped burning epileptics at the stake as well. We figured out at some point mothers don't cause schizophrenia in their children. It's not their fault because they unconsciously hate their child. It's a neurogenetic disorder. And as soon as that was sorted out, hundreds of thousands of mothers of people with schizophrenia were absolved from, you had no control. It had nothing to do with it. It's not your fault. And then we figured out, chronologically in my own lifetime, after I was like a school kid some decades later, like some kids don't learn how to read very well, not because they're lazy or stupid or unmotivated, but they got this screwy neurological thing called dyslexia. Like you can actually look in a microscope of like somebody's cortex and you will see the abnormal. Oh, they're not lazy. They got screwed in another way. Some people are screwed with it. This is the bad luck that they got handed. And not only was that a great realization, because you could get some insights now into how to teach somebody how to read more effectively if they have a learning difference and efficacy, all of that. But mainly, you're not raising people thinking that they're stupid and unmotivated. You get all these 40-year-olds who say, yeah, I got a dyslexia diagnosis last year. God, if I could only have gotten that when I was in fifth grade. I've spent my whole life hating myself, thinking that I'm just lazy and not smart. If only I could have found out then. And every time we figure out one of those, we're, 20 years into figuring out that people are not exercising free will when they decide they fall in love with somebody of their sex or the opposite sex. People are not exercising free will when they decide they've always felt like they're a different sex than their body says they are. Okay, all we're doing with each one of these, we're not going to figure out tomorrow how to completely get rid of a sense of free will because it'll be like sheer utter chaos, but we're doing this step by step. And each time the world becomes more humane, and it's like a much better world. Not only is the world not falling apart, it's much better that like Southern Baptists don't try to do conversion therapy on their gay teenage sons anymore, or beat Satan out of them for that. In all these cases, it becomes better. So we got to just keep pushing and doing more and more of that, because all sorts of realms where it seems intuitively obvious right now to us that somebody chose to do, they could have done otherwise. People in the future are going to look back on it and say, exactly, here's the pathways by which that person turned out to be who they were and why they had no control over what they did at that point. And, what barbarians people were back in the early 21st century, imprisoning some people and punishing them based on not understanding this, or telling other people that they are better, more worthy humans because they turn out to be smart at something and thus can do a successful hostile takeover of somebody's corporation. Or, they'll look back on us with that same sort of view. So we got to just keep pushing against it and keep assuming anytime you think you know why somebody has just done something, anytime you think you understand what the attribution is, you're almost certainly wrong. And you're almost certainly looking at it way too blindered, because you got to think about stuff way, way unexpected and below the surface and subliminal and ancient and nuanced and all of that. And you probably don't have a clue the things that went into making them who they are at that moment and why they did what they did.